Hello and welcome to episode 8 of the Terror Cellar. Today I have two frightening stories for you. One set in the early 1960s London and one of more contemporary times. But before I read the story, I just wanted to say thank you for all the support I'm getting. I'm getting some lovely support across all social media, and you know, my little fan base for the podcast is slowly growing, okay? And I've even been messaging other podcasters, especially my favourite, which is Real Life Ghost Stories with Emma. I think, you know, I've been listening to her show for years, and I've been a big fan. So I just messaged her again, because I've messaged her years ago, and I just said thanks for the inspiration. You know, thanks for inspiring me to do this and actually pull my finger out. So yeah, it's great to sort of socialise with all the others that are doing this too. But as I always say, it's time to stop talking and get on with the story, right? Now, this story was sent in by Essex John, and it's set in the early 1960s, and it is called The Ghost Guitar. Let's go back to London in the 1960s. The city was alive with music, and I was part of it. A struggling musician, playing every night, bouncing from one band to the next. I was a regular at all the big spots, rubbing shoulders with the up-and-coming stars. I'd brush past the legends of tomorrow, and even if fame never quite found me, I didn't mind. That was our life, the late nights, the crowds, and the camaraderie. In 1964, I shared a flat in Shepherd's Bush with Mike, a guitarist, and my closest friend in the city. Mike wasn't just a musician, he was a classic beatnik, wore the black turtlenecks, rode a motorbike, lived with a cigarette in hand. Our place was a basic, slightly run-down Edwardian flat, drafty and damp, with tall old windows that let in more cold than light. But it had a charm of its own, with stacks of records, piles of old books, and our guitars scattered around. We had put on records by John Lee Hooker, Muddy Waters and Chuck Berry, letting the music fill the flat as we smoked and talked into the early hours. Then one winter night, I caught a brutal cold. I couldn't go out, I couldn't play, so I was stuck at home while Mike headed out on his bike. I lay in bed, my throat raw and my head throbbing, wrapped in layers against the cold that seemed to creep in through those old windows. Without a TV, I was left with books and the radio for company. It wasn't the ideal way to spend a night, but we made do with what we had back then. Around 2 a.m, I was jolted awake by the sound of Mike's guitar. He was in the kitchen, playing one of his usual riffs, his foot tapping lightly against the floor in rhythm. I remember lying there, almost comforted by it, letting the familiar sounds settle over me. But this time felt a little different. The playing was slower, quieter, as if he were lost in thought. After a while, the music simply stopped. No footsteps, no creak of the floorboards, just silence. I was curious to know where he'd been that night, so I got up to check on him. I made my way to the kitchen, still half asleep, and there he was, standing at the sink with his back to me. I called out, "How was the gig, Mike?" expecting his usual tired grin, maybe a story or two about the night. But he didn't move or even acknowledge me. I figured he was just exhausted or lost in his own thoughts. So I didn't push him. I was desperate for the toilet anyway, so I quickly stepped away, intending to check back with him afterwards. When I returned, he was gone. The room was empty, but the air was thick with the smell of cigarette smoke, and the ashtray on the counter had a faint line of smoke rising from it. I assumed he'd just gone to bed, so I went back to my room, got under the covers, and drifted off, the cold air creeping in as usual. A few hours later, I was awakened by a loud, insistent knocking on the front door. Stumbling to my feet, I answered it and found myself squinting into the morning sun at a policeman, helmet on and waiting on my doorstep. He asked if he could come in, and I let him, wondering what trouble Mike might have got himself into. I told him to sit down, then excused myself saying I'd go and wake Mike up. I went to his room and knocked, but when I opened the door, his bed was untouched, just as he'd left it the day before. Confused, I walked back to the living room and sat down across from the officer, my mind racing with questions. The policeman looked at me with a calm but grave expression and said there'd been an accident the previous night. Mike's motorbike had been hit by a car around 10 p.m. He hadn't survived the collision. I remember sitting there, in stunned silence as he explained, not wanting to believe a word of it. In my mind, I was still hearing the guitar from the night before, seeing Mike standing there at the sink in the early hours, the smell of his cigarette smoke still lingering in the air. I told the officer I'd heard and seen him here, that Mike had come home, just like always. But the policeman looked at me, puzzled, and gently repeated the time of the accident. After he left, I sat alone in the silence of that empty flat, unable to process what had just happened. Had I really heard him playing? Had he been there in the kitchen, with his back turned to me, too still and too silent? I began to question everything, wondering if my grief and shock were twisting my memories. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew I'd heard his guitar. It was as if Mike had come back one last time, not yet ready to leave the life he loved. He'd had one final song to play, one last cigarette to smoke before he crossed over. I never heard his music again, but I often wonder about that night. Did he return to the flat, not realising he'd gone? Was he lingering for just one more moment in the place we'd called home? I've never forgotten young Mike, with his motorbike, his music and his spirit, living fast, loving the life we had and leaving too soon. Thanks so much for sending in that quite sad story, really. I mean, I guess a lot of the ghost stories are quite sad when you think of it like that. But I mean, to die so young and have your whole life ahead of you, you know, it must have been really shocking at the time. You know, I find it strange how some spirits find the need to return, and like we spoke about this before, and return and continue the journey they were on, you know, that day that they died, you know, whether it be heading to a pub or just heading home to your flat. It's like the spirit wanted to continue its journey as if maybe they didn't know they were dead. Maybe they didn't want to be dead. And this was their attempt of just getting on with things. But I like the story. I like the fact that he needed to play the guitar one more time, and I know how that feels, because that would be me. I would be there picking up my guitar one final time. Do you know what I mean? So I think when he was stood at the sink with his back to you, I think that's a little bit creepy, but maybe he just didn't hear you. He was in his world, you know, he was in his own dimension, so he couldn't acknowledge you at all. But yeah, thanks so much for sending in that story. And now for story number 2, The Graveyard Mist. Alright, picture this. I used to work as a groundskeeper at a local church graveyard. A pretty quiet job, mostly making sure the place looked presentable, cleaning old flowers and picking up trash, keeping things neat for the weddings and services, Usually, I worked during the day, but this one time, I ended up staying late into the evening. I was stuck trying to dig out this big stubborn bush that was hanging over some of the gravestones. The roots were deep and I couldn't get the thing out. The only light I had was from a floodlight on the side of the church. It was dark, but I had to finish the job because there was a wedding the following day and I couldn't leave the mess. Now let me tell you, the graveyard at night, it's always dead quiet, no pun intended. Once it gets dark, nobody's around. It could feel creepy to some people, but after a few years of working there, I wasn't the kind to get spooked easily. Besides, I never believed in ghosts or any of that stuff. Seemed a bit silly to me. That night though, it was windy. I'm talking trees swaying, leaves whipping through the air, making that loud rustling sound. The wind was crazy, so there I was, sitting on the ground with my shovel, trying to dig out the root, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. This strange, low mist. It wasn't fog like you'd expect. It was more like a slow-moving, cloud-like thing, hovering over the ground, just weaving through the gravestones. And what really got me was, despite the wind, this mist wasn't moving like it should. It just drifted. I stared at it, torn between finishing my work and watching this thing. I know it sounds odd, but I figured I had to get the job done. So I grabbed my saw and cut through the root and finally removed the bush. As I started shoveling the dirt back into the hole, the mist appeared right in front of me. Right there. Just hovering. It didn't feel like I was alone anymore. I swear it was like something was there, watching me, but nothing was physically there. And suddenly, I couldn't move. Not because I was scared. No, it was like I was frozen, held in place by something. Then, the mist drifted off again, moving through the graves, almost like it was searching for something. After a few seconds, it disappeared, just like that. No figure, no sound, but it gave off this unsettling feeling that someone was there. Someone who wasn't happy. It was bizarre. I finished filling in the hole and dragged the bush to the back of the church, where we kept old junk. When I got back to my spot, all my tools were scattered across the ground. The soil I'd just shoveled was all messed up, like someone had sabotaged the area while I was gone. But I didn't see anyone. There was no one there. Now, I'm not one to spook easily, like I said, but this was the first time I'd ever felt genuinely scared in that graveyard. I cleaned up as fast as I could and got out of there. I don't know what I saw or what was messing with me that night, but whatever it was, it didn't like me or my digging. Thank you to David Lee for sending in that ghostly story there from a graveyard. Now that's really interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, digging in a graveyard, I guess it starts to become a bit, you know, should I, shouldn't I? It's not like you're digging up a grave, but you're digging up the soil in which they lay. So maybe one of the spirits had a problem with that. Maybe it was offended by you doing this job, and it wanted to show its presence and try and, you know, make its presence known to you. And digging any hole in a graveyard, I guess, can be unsettling to something. But yeah, what a great story. And thank you for sending that one in. And so we close tonight's chapter in the Terror Cellar, where the ordinary can become extraordinary and the unseen lurks just behind our perception. Join us next time and keep your lights on and who knows who may be waiting in the dark. Don't have nightmares. Bye bye.